Have you ever wondered how some people get really good photos during the night? Well, in this video, I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to teach you how to take night photos, camera settings, gear, and how to edit them. So let's get started. Your aim during the night is to find any and all types of light sources, from street lamps to illuminated signs to shops that have huge glass windows or doors and a lot of light inside them, obviously. And also reflective surfaces to help you bounce light from a different light source onto your subject if you're taking night portraits. If you're starting for the first time to take photos during the night, there are three main techniques you need to learn. Number one is the well exposed photo. I call it this way simply because every photo you take is well exposed. You balance the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter to get enough information into the highlights, midtones, and shadows. The places you need to be in when you're taking these photos are the ones that have the most amount of light. Think of them as practice areas because they will show you what aperture value, shutter speed value, and ISO value you need to use for the rest of the night, especially if you're taking night portraits and not night street photography. Now for number two, the silhouette technique. To achieve this one, you need to expose for the highlights in your scene, and everything else has to be dark or darker. You'll need an aperture from 1.2 to 1.8, and you can get away with f2 only if your light sources are very bright. Now your ISO can be from a minimum of 100 to a maximum of 400 depending on your camera sensor. As for shutter speed, well, you can go above 1/100th of a second, since we don't need anything to be very well exposed, just the light source and everything that is lit by the light source. Now for number three, the long exposure technique. To achieve this one, you'll need a tripod, simply because the shutter speed will dictate how the photo will look, and any amount of vibration and shake will destroy the photo. You'll just have a blurb of light, even if you have a closed aperture and a low ISO. Now, if you're taking panning shots of a moving object, then you can get away with a faster shutter speed, let's say 1/10, 1/20 seconds, with a balanced aperture setting and ISO setting, obviously. Now, you can get away with not using a tripod if and only if your camera body has in-body image stabilization and you use an image stabilized lens. Obviously, you're not going to get the full potential of a long exposure photo like you get with a tripod, but let's say 70 to 80% you'll get there. Now, if you only use an image stabilized lens or a camera body that has in-body image stabilization, you'll be around, let's say, 50% of the result. But in the end, a tripod is necessary to get the maximum result. Now for camera settings, as mentioned before, the aperture has to be at least f4 or f8, and then you can go up to f22 if your lens lets you do that. Shutter speed, a minimum of 1/20th of a second, up to 30 minutes. If your camera lets you, again. And ISO 50 or 100, sometimes 200 depending on the scene. Besides shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, there is one more setting you need to know about, and that is noise reduction. Noise reduction does exactly what its name implies, reduces noise. More specifically, digital noise, that green and magenta grain noisy texture in your photos. Now, most modern cameras have this option in their picture profile menus when selecting a picture profile. Leaving it at 0 will just give you a small but insignificant amount of noise reduction. Increase it to its maximum value and you'll get softer photos, which later in the editing process you'll need to sharpen. But you'll have less and maybe no noise at all. Now, if you decrease the value, you'll eliminate any type of in-camera noise reduction and you'll have the highest amount of grain and noise in your photo, which later in the editing process will have to be reduced via a digital noise reduction. So in the end, if you want to leave it at 0, decrease it completely or increase it to its maximum, it's up to you. But either way, if you edit your photos, then in the editing process, you'll have to tweak either via digital noise reduction or digital sharpening. Now I'm going to jump over to Lightroom and show you my process on a well-exposed photo. And if you're using a different piece of software, don't worry. The principles and techniques I'm going to show you can be applied in almost any piece of software. Editing night photos depends solely on how you took them. Dark silhouettes, well-exposed, light streaks, and so on. So your edit has to complement the way you took them. Now let's jump in. I'm going to edit this one, which is a very good example of a well-exposed photo. My light source was this shop right here. And as you can see, the sky because of the settings I had in my camera, is a bit bright and also a bit blue. To fix this, I'm going to the mask, select sky. Let's see if this will give us the result we want. Perfect. Now I'm going to increase the contrast, decrease the highlights and the shadows, and desaturate it a little bit. And maybe the temperature towards the yellow side. Perfect. I did the mask first because Lightroom will read the sky as it is right now. This means a dark sky. It won't read what's underneath the mask. So all the main sliders will read that the sky is this dark and desaturated, not bright and blue. That's why using masks as a first step is important in some situations. Now, let's begin color correcting this photo. First, I'm going to drop my tint to 0, and I want to warm this photo up a bit. Somewhere around... You know what? Let's punch in 5000. Perfect. Now, shadows, do I need them? No. Let's decrease them. Highlights. Let's just leave them at 0 for now. Whites. Okay. This looks good. And let's see, blacks. No, let's brighten the photo up a bit. Around here. Good. Now, let's zoom in a bit. Change my zoom range to 33%. Texture. I want this to be more detailed, so I'm going to increase the texture, but not go over +20. Because I don't need that much. Now for clarity. No. Let's decrease it. Okay, this is good. And dehaze. Perfect. I'm not going to touch the vibrance and saturation just yet. Contrast. Let's decrease the contrast just a little bit, just under 30. Perfect. Now to curves. I want to drop and mute the highlights a little bit. Bring it back. I'm going to decrease the shadow to some extent and lift them up around 20. As you can see, this gives the photo a faded look in the shadows and in the black areas. Now, going down all the way to color grading. I'm not gonna stay in this triangle mode, so I'm going to go to the shadows. Let's see if I decrease the luminance, it gets too dark, so I'm going to increase the luminance, give it more fade, but keep it around 20. Now, for the midtones, I'm going to decrease them so I don't blow the highlights in the back. -19, good. Now for the highlights. Perfect, around here. Now I'm going to go back up and increase the highlights right here. This is good. Now one last touch in the color grading section is the blending. I want it to blend a little more, and the balance modes. The balance slider acts like this. Left is for shadows, right is for highlights. So I'm going to have it around here. Perfect. Now, sharpness, hit Alt on your keyboard and then drag the masking slider to see which areas are affected. So I want only this much and leave it at the default 40. Now for color noise reduction, this usually helps you to remove color noise like the green and magenta if you have any noise in the photo. In my case, I don't have much, so I'm just gonna leave it as it is on 25. Remove chromatic aberration. I'm not gonna use the lens profile correction because, as you can see, built-in lens profile is applied in my case. Now, this is the color correction part, where the exposure is dialed in to the point you want. In my case, this is what I want from the photo. Now, let's move on to the color grading part, where we affect every color in this photo, or almost every color. And we're going to start with curves. On the blue channel, we have blue up here, yellow down here. If we lift it up, we add blue, but if we drag it down, we add yellow. Right click, reset channel. In my case, I want to affect only the shadows and the blacks in the photo. So I'm going to hold down Alt, click a point here, click a point here, highlights and midtones to keep them in place. That's the purpose of these points. And then I'm going to drag just a little bit of yellow into the shadows. I'm going to add another point here just to straighten that line a bit. I'm not going to touch the green and the red channels for the edit I have in mind, just the blue channel. Now we can move over to hue, saturation, and luminance, also known as HSL. I have reds in the image. Yes, I have in his clothing. So I'm going to increase the saturation and the luminance. Orange, yes, we have it all over the place. But in this case, we have the brightest area, which resides in the yellow spectrum. As you can see, the changes happening right now. And the midtones and shadows in the orange area, as you can see right now. Even though orange is more predominant, we're going to affect the yellows first, bring them more to the orange side, increase the saturation, and if we increase the luminance, it brightens the photo. So we're going to leave it around 10. Now for orange, I'm going to take the luminance and increase it, and saturation. I'm not going to touch the hue because this balanced yellow-orange is enough for me. Greens, do have greens in the photo, a little bit here in the highlights, so I'm going to increase this, increase the luminance. Now for aqua, do you have anything? Apparently no. Blue, a little bit in the background up here, but irrelevant. Purple, only in the light way up here, doesn't matter. And magenta, again, only in the light up here, so it doesn't matter. We leave it as is. Now back to the color grading. I'm going to go back to the shadows. So I added yellow in the shadows and in the black areas. So I'm going to stick with the opposite and let's see what happens. I might change it. I don't know. So I'm going to increase the saturation. If I go 40, okay, I get a greenish hue. Let's decrease it. Okay. This switch will toggle on and off the effects. It will toggle off also the shadows, midtones, and highlights value, the luminance values. But to just check, okay, I'm going to leave it at this this blue hue, 210 if you want the value, and saturation 18. Usually with this this tool, I'm not going over 20 because it just, as you can see, it just messes up the photo too much. So I'm going to go back to 18. Now for the midtones, since I have a lot of yellow and orange, I'm going to go to this yellow green hue, 68 in this case, and increase the saturation to 16. And let's see if I move it towards blue. Now the skin changes, so I'm going to leave it right here, 68. Good. Now for the highlights, I'm just going to increase the saturation a lot to see which areas are affected the most. And if you remember, the light, at least in this photo, the light is more towards blue teal as a color. So I'm going to go to hue 180, and let's see if I punch in 15. Looks good enough for me at least. Now let's check all the way down where color calibration is. I'm going to go to the blue primary and see if I'm moving the hue. Okay, so I'm going to move the hue towards cyan more, and the saturation increased. Okay, around 40 is good. Let's check green primary. Okay, I'm going to move it towards yellow to regain my previous effect. And if I increase the saturation, it will also brighten the photo, so I'm going to decrease it to have it on the neutral side a bit more. And red saturation, it will just punch in back the colors, so I'm going to increase it just under 20. Okay, I'm going to press Y on the keyboard to see before and after. Okay, I'm very pleased with this outcome. But now I'm going to add just a little few touches using the masks again. And I'm going to click on the mask, create a new mask, and I'm going to choose a radial gradient. I'm going to click right at the edge, drag this oval mask. As you can see, I dragged it over where my light source is and also over the lights that are on the left side in the background. Now what I'm going to do is take the texture, decrease it, take clarity, decrease it, and take haze. As you can see, the glow, or at least a glow effect, started to kick in. I'm going to increase the contrast just to darken it a little bit. Increase the highlights for more light and shadows as well. And in this case, I think I'm going to, let's see, move the temperature and tint, make it more orange, and increase the contrast a little bit more. Now create another radial mask and drag it over this window and repeat the process. And this is it. This is my approach with this photo and these light conditions. This edit was fairly easy simply because the subject was well exposed and bright enough to let me do almost anything to the photo. But remember, the way you edit has to complement the way you took the photo. Otherwise, you'll have a hard time in the editing process. Now, if you have more questions about night photography, leave them in the comments below. While you're there, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and here you can see the other 2 episodes from this series. That's it for me. Until next time, take care.